Hi guys, welcome to Coffee Economics and to this week's news in review. Today we're going to be looking at a couple of stories and we'll get straight into it. So the first story I'm going to look at is the Russia grain deal. And I'm going to start the story by giving you a paraphrase from President Ruto, who said that when it comes to global interests versus national interests always win. And this is the case with this story. So Russia and Ukraine have a deal that they'll be able to export their grains because Russia and those two nations have a major impact in terms of production of grains and fertilizer. And those two things are really important. One for feeding people, and the other for making food which we eat, and for animals and all that sort of stuff. So this deal has come to an end, and Russia does not want to move ahead with the deal unless certain demands are met, such as allowing a particular bank to be reintegrated into the global banking system. So it's going to be an interesting deal. Whether this deal will be put together fast or it will take time because of the geopolitical situation that is currently happening with the Russia-Ukraine war, it remains to be seen. But the key things I want to share with this story is that, just like I said, paraphrased Ruto, that when it comes to global versus national interests always win. So in this case, if Russia does not ink a new memorandum of understanding, what it will mean is that grain prices and fertilizer prices will go up in price because Russia and Ukraine are major producers of those two things. And that means for African countries, particularly, food prices are going to rise, and input prices, particularly fertilizer, is going to be more expensive. So Africa as a nation doesn't have, people tend to be not eating enough food rather than having excess food. So if prices rise, people are going to be forced to still pay higher prices to be able to have enough food to eat. So some people might end up having to choose to starve rather than pay higher prices, which is a sad reality. And the thing is, with this is not an unavoidable situation. Africa, as we know, as a continent, has got lots of potential for land to be used for agriculture, but there's a lot of issues around, lack of policy, lack of corruption, insecurity, sanctions. All these are things that are not making Africa be able to produce the food that would meet the needs of its own people, plus have access to export. So even though Russia claims to be a friend of Africa, and if it was really thinking like altruistically about how not doing a new deal would impact on Africa, we can clearly see that even if someone claims to be a friend, particularly at a national scale, what is better for the economy is what will always win. And I think as Africans, this should teach us that even though we might be siding with one particular ally, we can't hold our allies too closely to the extent that we are not vigilant about how we grow our own economies. And that's the key thing that we need to learn, is to be able to build our own economies stronger, particularly when it comes to very sensitive or very critical things like food, health, defense, education, which are really critical for economic development, critical for survival of the nation itself. And I think as Africans, we need to be forward planning. And I think that's the critical thing. Even as individuals, just listening to this video, let's be always forward planning, thinking about, what will be the next steps I see myself in the next 10 years or 20 years. And I think if anyone wants to enter into policy, that's the thinking and mind frame that you need to be always thinking, what's the 10, 20-year vision? And that's what I think we should be expecting of politicians, particularly when they talk about economic policy. It's not about the policy that will meet the next election cycle, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 4 years, but what's their plan for 20, 30 years? What's their plan for 50 years? Because some of the things that Africa suffers are avoidable. Let's be honest. We could do better, and we should do better. The key thing I've mentioned here is that we need to be strategic. When it comes to national interest, people always do what they think is best for them rather than what will be best for their neighbor. So it's an interesting thing to see. So hopefully this deal gets through, because it's going to have negative impacts in terms of food for the African nations. Even though only 12% of the grains from the Russia-Ukraine region come to Africa, that's still a major amount of grains not coming to Africa, and it will make a big difference to people's livelihoods and well-being. So the next story I'm going to talk about is the next story I'm going to talk about is about the Iran-Zimbabwe deal or agreements, because I'm not sure if it's a deal yet. But this is very interesting. The Iranian president has gone to Kenya, is doing a few more stops on his African tour. Zimbabwe is one of those countries that he has come to. These countries are interesting that they're both isolated in the world. Zimbabwe has got some form of sanctions, as I've talked about in a previous video. If you want to check that video out, it talks about the war of words between the US and Zimbabwe and who's actually right. And if you're interested in finding out who's right about the sanctions thing, check out that video. I'll put it in a link below. But this deal is an interesting one, because if you're thinking about it, Iran is the one who's really pushing towards developing the economy, in a sense that they are going for deals in terms of putting up factories for tractor manufacturing and other deals that help Iran produce higher quality goods for their own economy, and maybe even to export within the region particularly. So it's an interesting development that Iran is going to Africa. It's seeing Africa as a place where it can develop business, can have business ties, which is good for Africa as long as we get good deals. The key questions I have about this deal is that these entities that are coming from Iran that will be set up in Zimbabwe, are they state-sponsored or they're private organizations? Because if they're state-sponsored, really, I guess it's sort of like they're taking money and just putting it in their own government and making money for themselves. Whereas if it's private entities, maybe there might be a chance for collaboration between other private entities in Zimbabwe. I'm not sure what sort of entities are driving this investment in Africa and in Zimbabwe in particular, but it's an interesting aspect that's happening. And also there's also another consideration that if de-dollarization actually happens, I don't think it's going to happen within the next decade. I think it might take much longer. That this move is a really good move for Iran, because if they're able to trade without using the US dollars, then they are sort of making themselves less. They're making themselves less reliant on They're making themselves less affected by the US dollar. I think which is really the goal here. They're trying to develop the economies outside the reach of the US, which is an interesting strategy in itself. So we'll see how this deal goes. We'll see how this develops, and it's going to be something that will develop over time. I hope that this deal actually creates jobs for Zimbabweans. I hope this deal actually creates opportunities for smaller firms in Zimbabwe to develop and grow, rather than just being money that will end up within the state's hands. So it will be interesting to see. The last story I want to talk about is Nigeria's fuel subsidy removal. So Nigeria historically had quite low petrol prices, like very low petrol prices, about half this price. So about less than 40 cents, 40 US cents. And now they've removed the subsidy because they can't afford it as a nation to do that, which is fine. But now the petrol prices have just gone through the roof. They've pretty much almost doubled within a short space of time, which means people cannot afford to travel, and it's going to make goods and services more expensive, because lots of things rely on fuel, on petrol to work or to move, like your cars and your buses, and then people use petrol to be able to power their houses, to have electricity as well. and even just heating and lighting and those needs. So it's very interesting that this is happening. The key thing I want to raise with this story is that strategy is really important for how you go from one state of the world to another state of the world. What I mean by that is going from having a subsidy to no subsidy, going from a very cheap fuel regime to now like 600 something naira within the space of 2 months is kind of ridiculous if you think about it. Not in most developed worlds, nothing goes up that fast unless it's particularly a necessary good doesn't go up that fast so quickly in such time. That's really, really fast. How this is where the strategy component comes in. The great thing about economics, it teaches you about what works better to making your economy grow. But one of the weaknesses of economics is it doesn't tell you the pathway of how to do it. Economics kind of treats each policy like an on-off switch. You turn it off, turn it on, and you turn on and it just works. But the way economies work is that when you turn off a policy or turn on a policy, the implications can be magnified and can take a bit of time to end up having the intended consequences you want. And those consequences are dependent on what else is happening in the economy. So with Nigeria being so dependent on oil for many different things, particularly being essential for travel to work and business, and essential for businesses to run their operations because the electricity grid is weak, then you add on top of that the exchange rate has been made liberal or free floating, which makes the price of the dollar be stronger and makes the naira weaker, so people have to spend more to import fuel. All of these kind of factors make the situation of fuel more expensive. If these things were dealt with in a systematic manner before in due course, for example, one of the issues is that Nigeria doesn't have oil refineries. If they had fixed that first, right, they're producing fuel in their own country so they can produce it at a cheaper price than importing. Then as well, if you were to improve the electricity grid so that people are not reliant on fuel to be able to have power to run their businesses and also to light and run their homes, it'll be a different story. So the impact of fuel on people will be much less. Maybe people can be able to substitute what they do. Instead of traveling to work, they can work from home because there's reliable electricity, reliable internet, that sort of thing. Or they can get electric bikes and stuff and heat it and recharge those things using the grid electricity. But that's not the case. It's kind of this policy of the subsidy was just turned off without any actual pre-planning, which is causing this massive pain for Nigerians. So this is a lesson on how economics, even though it's a great tool, it's very weak in terms of telling us what to do, how to sort of map out for your step by step. You should do this first, do that first, do that first. And this is one of the issues that I think, one of the issues that I want to touch on when I do a video on the IMF about that sort of process not being set in a way that makes sense for the country. So yeah, that's an interesting one. So guys, that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below. I'd love you to be able to get more of this content if it's of interest to you. And I've got more videos coming out in the future, so if you just hit subscribe, you'll be able to get notification when those come out. I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.